Out of sadness brought on by the separation, Theseus forgot to hoist the white sails, as his father had requested. King Aegeus, who was eagerly awaiting the return of his beloved son, felt his heart tremble at the sight of the boat returning with the black sails.
This is Plausibly Live, the official podcast of the Dave Bowman Show.
Well, good morning, good evening, or good afternoon, wherever you are, whatever you do. A lot of things happening in the world today, most of them far beyond our control, you might say. So perhaps it's time we took a pause and thought about life and thought about the laws of history, constitutions, ships, planks. Don't touch that dial. Try to hear me out for a little while. Thousands of years ago, we are told that a man by the name of Theseus defeated the Minotaur on the island of Crete. Maybe you've heard this story in the past. I had to go back and kind of reread a little bit. Some of my, what we call today Greek mythology, but was in fact Greek history at one point. Theseus's defeat of the Minotaur was remarkable for a couple of things. One, because it's basically the plot to the Hunger Games, right? He volunteers as tribune to go and probably be slaughtered by the Minotaur as a penalty that his nation is paying. But he goes with a plan. And of course, when he gets there, the daughter of the king falls in love with him. She gives him a ball of string, which in Greek, a clue, is what she gives him. And he uses that string to plot his way through the maze, where he defeats the Minotaur. The curse is lifted, and he gets back on the same ship, which left his hometown with black sails of mourning. And he had promised his father that if he was alive when they returned, they would change the sail color to white, of course, and forgot to do that because old Greek legends come with a sense of tragedy. And so here's your tragedy. The king kills himself. Theseus goes on to do many other things, including, by the way, the founding of the city of Athens. The ship, however, has a much more extensive story. Theseus, of course, is a man, and so he dies, but the ship is still there. And we are told by no less than Plutarch, in his various Lives book, that the Athenians maintained the ship for hundreds of years, and that over the century, they used the ship to sail to a nearby island where there was a shrine to the patron god of Athens, Apollo, and they brought a memorial offering for both Theseus and for what he had accomplished for Athens, and they presented it there, and they maintained the ship through the centuries for just this purpose. Now remember, we're talking about a wooden ship here. And so Plutarch informs us that over the centuries, the rotted and broken parts of the ship were regularly replaced with, quote, stronger planks, unquote. Over the hundreds of years that this story was told and taught and passed down to generation after generation of human beings, Thomas Hobbes, the famous philosopher, started to ask a question, and this has become known as the philosopher's question of the Ship of Theseus. And the question that you ask yourself in the thought experiment that you perform is, at what point over the centuries that the Athenians maintained this ship? Because we're told that they regularly replaced the rotting, broken parts. At what point is it no longer the Ship of Theseus, the ship that he sailed to and from Crete? At what point has it been completely and totally replaced with new parts? And it's not the same ship anymore. It is a completely new ship in some ways. It's recognizable as the Ship of Theseus, looks the same, but is it what it once was? And if everything on it has been changed, is it really what it once was? Now, through the history of this argument, you'll be happy to know that half of the philosophers that deal with this question seem to regularly come to the answer of, yes, it's the same ship. While the other half come to the opposite conclusion, which is that no, it's not the same ship anymore. What does this have to do with anything for us today on Constitution Thursday? 236 years ago, the framers of this nation sailed the Constitution into port, having returned from the convention, and said, we've accomplished what we set out to accomplish. And we have kept that ship for 2.5 centuries. And we will presumably keep it for more centuries to come. And yet, many of the planks of the Constitution have been replaced, haven't they? 27 times the Constitution has been amended. And many of those planks that have been replaced, many of those amendments, made it a stronger Constitution. They were, as Plutarch wrote, stronger planks. But it also includes that 14th Amendment, which Professor Akil Amar of the Yale Law School teaches, created a new constitution. In other words, it fundamentally transformed the Constitution into something completely new. It was it's in many ways the strongest plank of the Constitution today, but it didn't exist in 1787 or even 1789 on ratification. It didn't come about until much later on. And so the question is it really the same? Looks the same. Kind of, if you touch it, it's the same paper, but is it still the same? Now, the reason we ask this question with regards to the Constitution is, of course, the American framers and the founders of this country, as we've talked about over the last year, were strongly influenced by the Greek city-states, the Greek democracies. They found in the Greek democracies a great deal of positive things that they really liked. They knew that there were negatives, and in fact, Hamilton addresses this in Federalist number 9. He talks about the fact that they were unstable, they were violent, but there were still positive things that were seen, one of which was voting. We get our concept of voting from the Greeks. Hitherto, that really hadn't been the situation in the world. This idea that there were people who would gather and express their opinion through their votes on any given issue was and remains very, very intense to us. It's something that we like, and it's something that the Greeks' influence on the founders and the framers especially was important. The second thing that the Greeks did that really influenced the framers was the idea, and to a lesser degree the founders as well, because they had one too, we just don't talk about it, was this idea of a written constitution. This idea that you write it down. As so many people will say to you, if you didn't write it down, it didn't happen. Well, we wrote down our Constitution. Now, we had done that before. We had the Articles of Confederation, but, they weren't the same thing. They weren't quite as strong. In a way, if you looked at the United States, as the Ship of Theseus, you could say we replaced the planks of the Articles of Confederation with the Constitution. To do that as well. But we wrote that constitution down because this was something we had learned from the Greeks, the written constitution. The important thing to keep in mind here is that to the Americans of that era, this was not mythology. This was not, fanciful tales of Hollywood or whatever. This was Greek history. And they had been taught that history completely. They knew it so well. They could sit here and have discussions. I mean, you'll see in that book right there, you see the bookmark. Earlier today, I had to go look up the story of Theseus because I knew he killed the Minotaur, but I couldn't remember why. The founders and framers of this country knew exactly those stories, and they knew them like the back of their hands. They had learned it from childhood, and they knew those stories very well. And they influenced them, as we talked about in the stories that we tell. It influenced them for the positive good in creating a constitution that even they knew would be changed by time, be changed by amendment, changed by culture to become stronger even than it had originally been. Now, when we consider the Constitution of today, like the Ship of Theseus, is it really the Constitution of the framers? If James Madison were here today, would he recognize the Constitution? I think he would. I think he'd look at it and go, yeah, I recognize that part, and I recognize the first 12 amendments, but you've changed it since then. And does it still function the same? Is it really the Constitution of the framers? I would say, of course not. I would be on that side of the Ship of Theseus that says, no, it's not the same ship anymore. Nor did they intend for it to remain set in stone. They did not intend. That's why they put the amendment thing in there. But what about the underlying ideas of the Constitution? What about the underlying principles? Are those principles, are those ideas the same? Or have they been replaced? These ideas of originalism, these ideas of self-reliance, these ideas of liberty, do they still exist in the Constitution of today? Are they still there, or have those planks been replaced? Perhaps with stronger planks, but maybe not. A bigger question that I would ask is, how were those planks replaced? If they were there, how have they been replaced? And the answer is a little more concerning, I guess, in a way. How much Greek history do you know today? And by Greek history, I mean ancient Greek history. I don't necessarily mean, what happened in the Balkan Wars in 1912 and World War I and World War II. I get it. That's important. But when it comes to the history understanding that the framers and founders had, how much of that do we know? For that matter, how much of these stories are ingrained in us, much as they were in the framers? If I hadn't told you that Theseus was the guy that killed the Minotaur on the island of Crete, would you have remembered that? Would you even know that? But these stories, these legends, this history in Greek, ancient Greek history, was very celebratory. Also very tragic, because that's how the Greeks write their history. It always has to have a tragedy. But it's also very celebratory. We celebrate Theseus and his accomplishments. Not only do we celebrate his accomplishments, we keep the ship around for hundreds of years. And we keep using the ship over and over again to remind ourselves of what happened. Much as we, of the Jewish faith, keep the Passover to remind ourselves of what happened. Part of what we say in the Seder as we conduct that. In the same way, the Greeks kept that alive, and they kept that alive. But that celebratory history has now been, erased? Is it even taught anymore? I took a Greek history course, or a Greek myths course, when I was a senior in high school. It wasn't my favorite class. The teacher basically handed us a book and said, here, read this. And it was, the Greek myths, which of course I already had read and felt like I knew intimately. And then we took a test, who was who and who did what and what island did he go. There wasn't very much learning involved with it. But these were stories that were very familiar to me, and then hopefully they're familiar to you. But as celebratory history, we need to keep in mind that most tyrannies, I'm not talking about dictatorships, I'm not talking about military juntas, I'm talking about most tyrannies tend to delete celebratory history, whether that's actively in pulling down a statue or perhaps passively by not encouraging the remembering of that history, by not sailing that ship across to that small island to say, we remember what happened, by not maintaining that ship and its monument as a monument. It's not done anymore. And so, as we lose more and more of the planks of our Constitution, more and more the planks of liberty, the idea of what liberty means and what it requires of us, we got to ask ourselves that question. Why don't we teach this stuff anymore? Why is Greek mythology really, it's not familiar to people? I was so happy the other day that Ben is reading some book, and I know it's not pure Greek mythology. Percy something son Jackson, Percy Jackson, and the Mount of Olympus. And I know it's not Greek mythology, but at least it's giving him those ideas. And I read through it, so I have some familiarity with it. Because otherwise, losing these ideas, losing these stories, losing these concepts, losing these understandings means that with the planks that we're replacing on the Constitution, on our constitutional Ship of Theseus, whatever you want to call it, means that every time we replace one of those, we have to ask that question, is it still the same thing? Or has it become different somehow? And in that becoming different somehow, have we lost something? Or is it really still the same?